5 weeks ago, the sailing yacht Soulmate was just another boat anchored in paradise. Today, according to the material provided, it sits behind federal tape in Florida, while investigators reportedly examine every inch of it as part of an expanding investigation into the disappearance of Lynette Hooker. And that shift may tell us everything about why this case has become impossible to ignore. Because at first the story sounded tragically simple. A husband and wife returning to their yacht after sunset. A small dinghy crossing dark water, rough seas. A sudden accident. One person survives, one vanishes into the ocean. Stories like that happen more often than people realize. The sea is unpredictable, even for experienced sailors. One wrong moment in darkness can turn routine into disaster in seconds. But according to the reporting provided, investigators may no longer believe the ocean tells the full story. And that is where this case begins to change. Not because of one dramatic revelation, not because of a confession, but because of a growing number of details that reportedly stopped fitting together cleanly. The weather, the timeline, the physical evidence, and eventually, the digital traces left behind aboard the Soulmate itself. Before we go further, something important needs to be said clearly. Brian Hooker has not been charged with a crime. Legally, he remains innocent unless proven otherwise. And in a case filled with speculation, rumor, and intense online attention, that distinction matters. This video is not about declaring guilt. It is about examining why federal investigators reportedly seized the boat, why forensic teams are allegedly focusing on onboard systems and electronic evidence, and why one missing woman's final known hours have become the center of a growing maritime mystery. Because according to the material provided, the investigation appears to have shifted away from a simple search and rescue narrative and towards something much more complicated. And strangely enough, one of the biggest turning points may have involved something small enough to fit on a wrist, a watch. According to the transcript, Lynette Hooker was reportedly seen earlier that evening wearing a pink Apple Watch. Later, federal agents allegedly found that same watch sitting on a charger inside the Soulmate. If accurate, that detail raises a question investigators cannot afford to ignore. How did it get there? That question alone does not prove a crime occurred. There may be explanations investigators are still testing. But if Lynette made it back onto the yacht at some point that night, then the center of this case may no longer be the ocean at all. It may be the boat. And in the modern world, boats remember things. Wi-Fi systems reconnect devices automatically. Electrical systems log activity. Cameras store footage. Routers create timestamps. Digital systems quietly build timelines in the background of ordinary life. Which means the Soulmate may not just be evidence, it may be a witness. And to understand why investigators reportedly became so focused on that boat, we first have to understand the story Brian Hooker told about what happened the night Lynette disappeared. According to the material provided, the disappearance of Lynette Hooker began with a distress call placed on April 4, 2026, somewhere near the waters around Elbow Cay in the Bahamas. At the center of that call was Brian Hooker, Lynette's husband, an experienced sailor and former Marine, who had reportedly spent years living aboard the Soulmate with her. His story painted the picture of a maritime nightmare. Brian allegedly told investigators that he and Lynette had spent part of the evening ashore before attempting to return to their yacht in a small dinghy after dark. According to his account, conditions on the water had become rough and unpredictable. He reportedly described strong winds and swells powerful enough to make the small boat difficult to control. Then, according to Brian, everything went wrong very quickly. He claimed an oar was ripped from his hands during the chaos. At some point afterward, Lynette allegedly fell overboard into the darkness, and then she was gone. According to the story Brian reportedly gave investigators, he spent hours drifting alone before eventually washing ashore near Marsh Harbor around 4 o'clock in the morning on Easter Sunday. For weeks, that explanation stood as the only known version of events. There were no publicly known eyewitnesses to the alleged accident itself, no confirmed footage from the water, no recovered body, no public forensic reconstruction. Just one survivor trying to explain how another person disappeared into open ocean during the night. And to be fair, maritime accidents can be incredibly difficult to investigate. The ocean destroys evidence quickly. Darkness distorts distance and direction. Panic affects memory. Even experienced boaters can become disoriented under stress. In many cases, investigators are forced to reconstruct events using fragments rather than certainty. Which is why at first glance, Brian's account may not have sounded impossible. A couple returning to a yacht, bad conditions. a small, unstable dinghy. One tragic moment, but according to the material provided, investigators eventually began testing whether the surrounding evidence actually supported that sequence of events. Because believable stories and provable stories are not always the same thing. Investigators reportedly started asking very specific questions. Did weather conditions match Brian's description? Did the timeline remain consistent? Did physical evidence support the idea that Lynette never made it back to the Soulmate? And most importantly, did the digital evidence aboard the yacht reinforce the original account or contradict it? Those questions would slowly begin changing the direction of the investigation. Because, according to the transcript, the first serious issue investigators reportedly encountered was not hidden inside the boat. It was outside in the weather itself. According to the material provided, one of the first major cracks in Brian Hooker's story may have appeared somewhere investigators often trust more than memory: the weather. Brian allegedly described the water that night as dangerous and chaotic. In his version of events, the conditions were severe enough to overpower a small dinghy, tear an oar away, and separate him permanently from Lynette in darkness. If accurate, that kind of environment would help explain how a short trip back to the Soulmate could suddenly become catastrophic. But according to the transcript, investigators reportedly reviewed meteorological data and footage from the same general time frame that appeared to show much calmer conditions near the area. That detail immediately raised an important question. If the water was not as violent as described, then how much pressure does that place on the original story? Now, it is important to be careful here. Calm footage from one area does not automatically prove every nearby section of water was calm. Ocean conditions can shift quickly depending on wind exposure, tide movement, and geography. But investigators reportedly did not dismiss the contradiction, because this was not just about whether the sea looked rough. It was about whether the physical mechanics of the story made sense. Could the conditions Brian described realistically create the exact sequence of events he claimed occurred? That question became even more important once investigators reportedly started rebuilding the timeline. According to the material provided, surveillance footage from the Abaco Inn captured Brian and Lynette together at approximately 6:34 p.m. On the evening Lynette disappeared, the footage reportedly showed Lynette calm and relaxed near the pool area. Brian later allegedly stated that the couple left to return to the Soulmate around 7:30 p.m. That creates a surprisingly tight window, less than 1 hour between the last known public sighting and the moment the alleged maritime disaster supposedly unfolded. Investigators reportedly began examining every part of that timeline carefully. The departure, the dinghy ride, the alleged accident, Brian drifting for hours, his reported arrival near Marsh Harbor around 4 in the morning. And according to the transcript, there were details investigators allegedly found difficult to reconcile. One of them involved Brian's condition after reaching shore. Brian reportedly told people he had moved through rough terrain, including rocks and heavy brush, while searching for help during the early morning hours. But according to the material provided, responders later encountered him wearing light blue slide sandals. That detail may sound small, but investigators often focus on the ordinary things that do not fit naturally into a timeline. Could someone cross difficult terrain wearing slides? Possibly. But if the journey happened exactly as described, investigators may ask whether the footwear, injuries, and route all align logically with the story. Then came another question: the driver. According to the transcript, Brian allegedly claimed he attempted to flag down a passing vehicle around 4 in the morning after reaching land, but the driver reportedly ignored him and continued away. Investigators are reportedly still interested in identifying whether that person exists, because if someone saw Brian at that exact time and place, it could help confirm part of his timeline. If no such witness exists, the timeline becomes harder to anchor independently. And this is how investigations slowly change direction, not through one explosive contradiction, but through multiple details creating pressure on the same story at the same time. The weather, the timing, the terrain, the unidentified driver. Separately, each detail may have an explanation. Together, according to the material provided, they appear to have pushed investigators toward a much larger question. What if Lynette Hooker actually made it back onto the Soulmate that night? Because according to the transcript, investigators reportedly found something aboard the yacht that may have changed the entire direction of the case. A pink Apple Watch sitting on a charger inside the boat. In many missing person investigations, there is one detail that changes everything. Not because it proves guilt immediately, not because it solves the mystery overnight, but because it forces investigators to reconsider where the truth may actually be hiding. According to the material provided, that detail in the Lynette Hooker case may have been an Apple Watch. Lynette's daughter, Carly Ellsworth, reportedly described a habit that investigators would likely consider important. She said that whenever Lynette returned to the Soulmate, one of the first things she typically did was remove her jewelry and place her Apple Watch on its charger. At first, that sounds completely ordinary, but ordinary routines become extremely important when investigators are trying to determine whether someone reached a specific location before disappearing. According to the transcript, surveillance footage from earlier that evening reportedly showed Lynette wearing a pink Apple Watch on her wrist while she and Brian were at the Abaco Inn. That establishes a critical starting point. If Brian's version of events is completely accurate, Lynette never successfully returned to the Soulmate after leaving shore. According to the story, she allegedly disappeared in the water before the couple could safely make it back to the yacht. But according to the material provided, when federal agents later searched the Soulmate, Lynette's Apple Watch was reportedly found sitting on its charger inside the boat. And if that detail is accurate, investigators suddenly face a completely different question. How did the watch get there? There are several possibilities investigators would likely need to examine carefully. The first possibility is the one that immediately changes the geography of the case. Lynette may have successfully returned to the Soulmate at some point that night before something else happened later. A second possibility is that someone moved the watch afterward, intentionally or unintentionally. And a third possibility is that public interpretations of the timeline remain incomplete or partially misunderstood. At this stage, none of those explanations are confirmed. But what matters is that the watch reportedly forced investigators to shift their attention away from the open ocean and back toward the yacht itself. Because if Lynette made it onto the Soulmate, then the boat may contain far more answers than investigators originally believed. And according to the transcript, that realization reportedly pushed federal investigators deeper into the vessel's onboard systems and digital records. Modern yachts are no longer just boats. They are floating networks, 5 systems, security cameras, battery management systems, navigation equipment, connected devices, digital logs quietly recording ordinary activity in the background of daily life. According to the material provided, investigators reportedly began examining whether those systems aboard the Soulmate could reveal what happened during the critical hours after Brian claimed Lynette disappeared. And that possibility may be one of the most important developments in the entire investigation, because digital systems do not rely on memory. They rely on timestamps. If a phone reconnects to Wi-Fi, the system may record it. If power usage changes, the system may log it. If someone enters the cabin and activates equipment, traces may remain behind. According to the transcript, investigators reportedly focused particular attention on the Starlink system aboard the Soulmate, including possible router logs that could show when devices reconnected to the yacht's network. That detail matters enormously, because if Lynette's devices reportedly reconnected to the Soulmate after the time she was allegedly lost at sea, the original timeline could face serious problems. And then there is the camera. According to the material provided, investigators reportedly discovered a security camera positioned beneath the bimini area near the cockpit, close to where Brian and Lynette would allegedly have boarded the yacht after returning from shore. If that system was functioning that night, investigators may eventually be able to determine who returned to the boat and when. And suddenly, the case no longer depends entirely on human recollection. It depends on what the Soulmate itself may have recorded. According to the material provided, once investigators reportedly shifted their focus toward the Soulmate itself, the case began evolving from a missing person investigation into something far more technical, because modern boats leave behind digital traces in ways many people never think about. Everyday actions can quietly create records. A light turns on, a device reconnects to Wi-Fi, a refrigerator opens, a battery system registers power usage, a camera stores footage. None of those details seem important in ordinary life, but in a forensic investigation, they can become pieces of a timeline. According to the transcript, investigators reportedly began examining the Soulmate's digital systems to determine whether the onboard data matched Brian Hooker's version of events or contradicted it. That distinction matters. If Brian's account is accurate, investigators would likely expect little or no activity connected to Lynette after the alleged dinghy accident. But if systems aboard the yacht suggest otherwise, the implications become much more serious. One of the most discussed details in the provided material involves the Starlink internet system reportedly mounted aboard the Soulmate. According to the transcript, investigators allegedly began analyzing whether connected devices may have automatically rejoined the yacht's Wi-Fi network during the critical hours that night. That may sound technical, but the idea is actually simple. Most phones, smartwatches, and tablets reconnect automatically when they come within range of a familiar network. If Lynette's phone or watch reportedly reconnected to the Soulmate after the time she was allegedly lost at sea, investigators would likely consider that extremely important. Again, that would not automatically prove a crime occurred. Devices can remain aboard without their owners. Logs require verification. Digital records can be misunderstood without proper context. But according to the material provided, investigators reportedly believed the data was important enough to justify a major forensic review of the vessel. And then there is the question of the onboard camera. According to the transcript, federal agents allegedly discovered a security camera positioned beneath the bimini area near the cockpit, close to where Brian and Lynette would supposedly have boarded after returning from shore. If that camera was functioning during the critical timeline, investigators may eventually be able to determine whether one person returned to the boat that night or two. That possibility may explain why investigators reportedly focused heavily on recovering digital files and mirroring hard drives from the yacht. Because unlike human memory, recorded systems can sometimes preserve details people either forget or never realize were documented at all. And according to the material provided, investigators were not only examining what happened before Lynette disappeared, they were also reportedly paying close attention to what Brian Hooker did afterward. Because in many investigations, behavior after an event becomes part of the larger picture investigators attempt to understand. And according to the transcript, some of Brian's actions after leaving the Bahamas reportedly raised additional questions. In high-profile missing person cases, public attention often shifts quickly from the event itself to the behavior of the people closest to it. How did they react? What did they do next? Did they stay? Did they leave? Did they help search? Did they withdraw completely? But experienced investigators usually approach those questions carefully because trauma affects people differently. Some become emotional and highly visible. Others shut down entirely. Fear, grief, legal advice, and exhaustion can all influence behavior in ways that outsiders may misunderstand. That context matters in the Lynette Hooker case because, according to the material provided, investigators and Lynette's family reportedly became increasingly focused on Brian Hooker's actions after the disappearance. According to the transcript, Brian was briefly detained by Bahamian authorities, but was not charged with any crime. After his release, he reportedly obtained an emergency passport and left the Bahamas within approximately 24 hours. Brian allegedly told people he was traveling to California to visit his sick mother. On its own, that decision may not sound suspicious. People dealing with trauma often want distance from painful locations. Attorneys may also advise clients to avoid public exposure during active investigations. But according to the material provided, additional details reportedly intensified concern around Brian's behavior afterward. The transcript claims Brian allegedly did not return to the Bahamas to continue searching for Lynette or personally retrieve the Soulmate. Instead, he reportedly hired a private crew to sail the yacht back to the United States while he remained away from the vessel. For Lynette's family, that reportedly became emotionally difficult to understand. According to the transcript, Lynette's mother, Darlene Hamlet, and her daughter, Carly Ellsworth, allegedly experienced long periods of silence from Brian after the disappearance. Carly reportedly celebrated her birthday without hearing from the man who had supposedly been part of her life since childhood. Again, none of this proves criminal wrongdoing. That distinction is critical. Silence is not evidence. Distance is not evidence. Unusual behavior is not evidence by itself. But investigators sometimes examine post-incident behavior through what is informally called consciousness of guilt analysis. The question is not whether someone acted strangely. The question is whether their actions appear consistent with the explanation being given. Did someone avoid a place because of grief, because of fear, because of legal strategy, or because they believed evidence might still exist there? Those are the kinds of questions investigators reportedly appear to be testing in this case. At the same time, according to the material provided, federal authorities reportedly continued escalating the investigation itself. The Soulmate was seized. Digital systems were examined. Forensic reviews were initiated, and investigators allegedly began building what may become a complex maritime case centered heavily on circumstantial and electronic evidence. But despite all the public speculation surrounding the case, one fact still remains unchanged. Brian Hooker has not been charged, and that raises an important question. If investigators reportedly suspect contradictions in the timeline and potentially significant digital evidence aboard the Soulmate, why has there not yet been a public indictment? The answer may lie in the way federal maritime investigations are built. Because according to the material provided, cases like this often move much slower than the public expects. According to the material provided, one of the biggest misconceptions people have about federal investigations is the idea that arrests happen immediately once investigators become suspicious. In reality, federal cases often move slowly, especially when prosecutors believe the final case may depend heavily on forensic reconstruction rather than direct eyewitness testimony. And the Lynette Hooker investigation appears to fit that pattern. The transcript specifically references the involvement of the United States Coast Guard Investigative Service, or CGIS, along with the reported seizure of the Soulmate after it entered international waters. That detail is important because maritime investigations operate under a very different legal framework than ordinary criminal cases on land. Under certain circumstances, federal authorities can exercise jurisdiction over incidents involving American citizens, American-owned vessels, or alleged crimes committed on the high seas. According to the material provided, investigators reportedly used that authority to take control of the Soulmate and transport it to Florida for forensic analysis. But seizing a vessel is not the same thing as proving a crime occurred. And that distinction may explain why investigators reportedly appear to be moving carefully, because this could become what prosecutors call a no-body case. Without a recovered victim, investigators face enormous challenges. They must establish not only that a crime may have happened, but where it happened, how it happened, and why the available evidence supports that conclusion beyond reasonable doubt. That is not easy. Defense attorneys could potentially argue that the ocean itself explains the disappearance. They could argue that the timeline confusion resulted from trauma. They could challenge digital interpretations. They could point to contamination aboard the Soulmate after multiple people reportedly accessed the vessel. And according to the transcript, that possibility already exists because delivery crews later sailed the yacht back to the United States. But investigators reportedly appear focused on something else entirely. The idea that modern digital evidence may allow them to reconstruct events with unusual precision. Not through rumor, not through emotional reactions, but through timestamps, reconnection logs, onboard activity, and forensic analysis of the yacht itself. In many modern investigations, prosecutors increasingly rely on systems quietly recording everyday behavior in the background of ordinary life. A device reconnects, a file is deleted, a camera records movement, a system logs activity. Individually, those details may mean very little. Together, they can build a timeline stronger than memory, and according to the material provided, that may ultimately determine where this case goes next. Because if the digital evidence aboard the Soulmate reportedly supports Brian Hooker's version of events, the investigation could move in one direction. But if the evidence contradicts that story, the consequences could become much more serious. Right now, investigators reportedly continue analyzing the forensic record while Lynette Hooker remains missing. And somewhere inside that investigation may be the answer to the question that has followed this case from the beginning. What really happened during the final hours? Lynette Hooker was known to be alive. At the center of this entire case is a reality that should never be forgotten. Lynette Hooker is still missing. It is easy, especially online, for investigations like this to become consumed by theories, speculation, and arguments over details. People debate timelines, digital records, weather reports, and legal strategy. But behind every forensic discussion is a real family still waiting for answers. According to the material provided, Lynette's mother and daughter are now living in the painful space between uncertainty and acceptance. They are reportedly discussing memorials while investigators continue testing whether the original account of Lynette's disappearance can survive forensic scrutiny. And that may be the hardest part of all, not knowing. Because right now, despite the growing attention surrounding the Soulmate, despite the reported digital evidence, despite the federal involvement, the public still does not fully know what happened that night. What exists instead is a collision between two things, a story, and the evidence investigators are reportedly using to test it. On one side is Brian Hooker's account of a tragic maritime accident involving darkness, rough water, and sudden loss at sea. On the other side are the questions that reportedly began pulling investigators back toward the yacht itself. The weather, the timeline, the unidentified driver, the Apple Watch, the digital systems aboard the Soulmate. Individually, any one of those details may have an explanation. But according to the material provided, together they appear significant enough for federal investigators to continue pursuing the case aggressively. Still, suspicion is not proof. That distinction matters legally, it matters morally, and it matters for responsible coverage of cases involving real people and unresolved tragedy. At the same time, refusing to rush to judgment does not mean ignoring contradictions when they appear. And perhaps that is why this case continues to hold so much public attention. Because in the modern world, people no longer disappear without leaving traces behind so easily. Phones reconnect automatically. Devices store location history. Networks create timestamps. Digital systems quietly document ordinary life in ways most people never notice until investigators begin rebuilding a timeline. According to the material provided, investigators reportedly believe the Soulmate itself may still contain pieces of Lynette Hooker's final known hours. Maybe the forensic evidence will eventually support Brian's account. Maybe investigators will determine this was, in fact, a terrible maritime accident shaped by darkness, panic, and confusion. Or maybe the digital record will reveal something very different. Right now, no one outside the investigation can honestly claim certainty. And that may be the most honest ending possible at this stage of the case. Not certainty, not accusation, but questions still waiting for answers. If you followed this case all the way through, let me know respectfully in the comments which detail you believe investigators will ultimately consider most important. The weather, the timeline, the Apple Watch, or the digital evidence reportedly recovered from the Soulmate itself. And if this story stayed with you, consider sharing the video with someone who values careful investigation over instant conclusions. Because cases involving missing people deserve more than noise. They deserve patience, precision, and eventually, the truth.